As you know, the topic of this panel discussion is human rights discourse in South Asia. But I have a duty to announce with the deepest sense of condolences and sympathies to one of our panelists who is from Maldives. She is president of Human Rights Commission. She got the news this morning of a sad demise of her father, and she had to leave this morning. I tried to contact her over phone, but before I could reach her, she had boarded the flight to fly back. Allow me with this sad news to continue with our tradition of having a panel discussion on the annual theme of the SAARC Charter Day. And it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome our distinguished panelist of this year. From Nepal, we have our distinguished panelist is Mr. Kalyan Shrestha, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Nepal during parts of years 2015 and 16. He is Chairperson, Judge of South Asia, Law Enforcement and Law Enforcement Agencies, SAARC. In his long judicial career of about 3 decades, he also has had a first-hand experience of the ground as a judicial officer in Nepal. Some of his recent international engagements include in the area of human rights, judicial activism, judicial independence, judicial accountability, constitutional justice, and gender justice. From Sri Lanka, we have the distinction of having Professor Savitri Gunasekere, who is Emeritus Professor of Law, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. She was formerly Professor of Law and Vice Chancellor, University of Colombo, and a member of Expert Committee, treaty body, monitoring the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women from the years 1999 to 2002. She is a member of several national, regional, and international bodies on human issues. She has published widely on family law, women and children's rights, human rights law, and development issues. Now, with this brief introduction of our distinguished panelist, my understanding is that I should not be coming between you and our distinguished panelist. So right away the floor is given to the students so that they may have their questions, their issues of interest they would like to put to the panelists so that we may have a lively discussion on each of the issues that you would raise. The floor is now open. However, I would request you to identify and also identify your nationality so that there should be some relevance in responses of the panelists that you would expect. Thank you. Please, one by one, you should raise issues or questions that you may have to our panelists. We can also have it, you see, ma'am, we can have a short, note if you want to have a message, then we can invite questions or we right away we invite questions first.
Stop your way first.
Yeah. So we may, we are open. We have both ways open. If you have to make a short sort of statement, that's what Professor Parera is saying.
I think according to the program,
Yes.
of the panel discussions, we speak first, the
That's
panelists,
right.
and then
Please.
We-
You go for each issue flow.
Fine.
Or
Yeah, Professor Gunasekar, you should
Fine.
start.
We do that.
According to your program.
Yes, yes, we will.
There are a couple of questions.
Yes, yes, they will,
and
they will, yeah, they will.
Then you will have to touch upon the
Yes,
question that
yes,
you have
fine.
before. Then allow us to speak on that, then the floor should be open, or
Yes, fine.
the questions should be addressed first.
Fine.
Then the floor should be open.
Whatever is needed, we are open to both ways. Yeah, we have both ways, yeah,
Yeah?
yeah, we have both ways.
Sure, you decide first.
Yeah. Ma'am, maybe you start first. Yes, start.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Pratap and colleagues from the Department of Law and the South Asian University for inviting me to participate in this panel. I recognize several people. One of the advantages of being an emeritus professor is you recognize people in your other life. So I have had the pleasure of interacting with Justice Kshetra from the time he was probably not at the apex court, and also with Dr. Sasanka Pereira, a colleague from my own university, University of Colombo, and more recently Srinivas Vura on another program. So it's a pleasure to be with you and to be with the students. I have been on several SARC initiatives. One, a committee on children. Another initiative where a lot of time was spent on developing a SARC gender information base, neither of which really took off. So it's a pleasure to see the SARC initiative which is institutionalized, because this is what is important. When SARC doesn't institutionalize things, they tend to evaporate with changes. But an institution goes on, and so it's a great pleasure to be here. I wish you all a great deal of success in the future, and I hope, I don't see anyone from the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, but what should be done is this should be integrated into the higher education system of each university. In my country, the regulatory authority is University Grants Commission, so that like in the case of other regional groupings, the Commonwealth, the Fulbright, the institution is taken on as a part of the country's initiative. So I hope that takes place in the case of the University of Colombo. I've been asked to speak on the issue of the universality of human rights and just make some brief remarks on that. South Asia is the only region in the world which does not have a document, a declaration on human rights. It's the only region in the world which has no institutions on human rights. Africa, Latin America, Europe, now the ASEAN region. So when we talk human rights, we are talking in terms of national initiatives, national developments in human rights, rather than a SARC institutional mechanism, which I think it came out very powerfully in the presentation and the keynote speech by Dr. Kamal Hossain. We have had enormous vibrance in the jurisprudence, in the initiatives, as Justice Kshetra himself knows, in the judiciary on human rights. So let's therefore recognize that the universality of human rights has been internalized in our countries, even though we don't have these regional initiatives. And in a sense, it's ironical that we don't have a regional initiative, because our countries have all absorbed human rights concepts, norms into their constitutions. We have the constitutional chapters on fundamental rights, and they are justiciable. Unlike in many countries of Southeast Asia, for instance, where they are aspirational, no method of enforcement. So we have these structures for enforcement, and therefore the courts, for instance, play a very important role. We have institutions called human rights commissions, which are also powerful. So at the national level, we have had the consensus, the institutions which are common, which are parallel across the board. Now, why this ambivalence? I think the ambivalence has been there from the past, but it's also there very currently today, and I'd like to focus on that. What are the challenges to this universalism that we have captured in our constitutions, which we have? One is our colonial past. Because of our colonial past, though we have, in my view, absorbed some of the best traditions of Western jurisprudence, particularly human rights is about it's really universal, because it's about the struggle for power, controlling power. and accountable governance. Human rights have been born out of human suffering. So when we say West, we locate it in experience which actually is universal. Because all these rights, freedom of speech, freedom from detention, freedom from torture, was born out of human suffering and encapsulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the other instruments that have followed, as Dr. Hussain mentioned. So it's human experience on human rights which we have also internalized in our own countries. But we have this ambivalence. We keep referring to human rights as a Western discourse. Sometimes in our countries, very powerful. It has nothing to do with us. Then we have the whole idea of ethno-nationalism. We have the reality of ethno-nationalism, identity politics based on race and religion, consequently arguing that individual rights are really non-Asian because we are interested in communities and community well-beings, and therefore we have to recognize identity. And when identity conflicts with some of the norms of human rights, like core norm of equality, then you justify and you say, these are not universal. They are not relevant to our region because of our diversity. And that's why many of our countries have entered reservations to the human rights treaties, CEDAW reservations, Bangladesh, India had a declaration saying, we will ratify, but we won't touch our personal laws. So that is an issue which makes it difficult to absorb the idea of universality. And then, of course, we have the cynicism that comes with the enormous violation of human rights. Then you ask, what is the meaning of human rights? They are violated in all our countries in South Asia, they are violated globally, so what is the point of it all? Now, I think it's important to take the approach that Dr. Kamal Hussain took and to recognize that globally we have absorbed thinking, ideologies, etc. about containing abuse of power and accountable good governance, which are located in human rights. And consequently, we have to meet those arguments and say, no, human rights are valid, are universal, despite the other criticisms that are made about them. And to prove that universality, I'd like to, and the importance and relevance of it, I'd like to just focus a minute on something again which Dr. Hussain referred to, but which is the fact that human rights have developed. They have developed significantly since 1948. And the greatest development took place at the World Conference in Vienna. When the World Conference in Vienna took place, actually, these different discourses, the challenge to human rights as a Western discourse, which is not relevant for the diversity of South Asia, they surfaced in two separate, in a pre-conference declaration called the Bangkok Declaration, where all the countries which met from Asia said, human rights is Western. It has nothing to do with us, because they are individualistic. They are based on ideas which are not communitarian. We believe in socioeconomic rights. So for us, well-being goes with socioeconomic rights and not with civil and political rights. So that bifurcation took place before Vienna. And in Vienna, civil society was greatly active and they helped the states to forge a consensus. So now we are talking universality in a context where we are saying that human rights is no longer located exclusively in the experience of civil and political rights, which is the traditional West. But they are also located in socioeconomic rights. As Dr. Hussain pointed out in the morning, we have indivisibility. And I like to suggest that today, in Vienna, we said universal is one concept, indivisible is one concept. Indivisible meaning both sets of rights are important. Now I think today we can say that universality of human rights is reinforced by the idea of indivisibility of rights. So if both sets are rights are important, we have all achieved in our own way, the West as the other countries, a confluence of ideas on human rights. And so they are universally relevant because we know that it is simplistic to say that torture, detention, etc. is not relevant for the poor. And to argue that you have to first put socio-economic rights in place before you go for civil and political rights. They are not a series of rights to be implemented in stages. They are both indivisible, therefore they must be realized. So the argument, therefore, which is still used in the West, that socio-economic rights are really policy. They are not law. Law means hard rights, torture, etc., arrest. That has now been replaced by the idea that if you're going to address poverty, you have to address freedom of speech, you have to address freedom from detention, you have to address freedom from torture, as importantly as you give access to health and education. So we have absorbed that discourse, and then our countries have ratified international instruments which are now giving this new concept of human rights. Not the concept that this is just civil and political rights, but something much more solid, and that has been accepted by our countries, where they have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on Disabilities. All the new conventions are seeing a confluence between these. So I think the power of universality is in locating it in the fact that now human rights are both universal and indivisible, and the matching of the two sets of rights means that no longer can they be criticized as a Western civil political tradition. And I think that has been our contribution. Then again, as Dr. Hussain pointed out in his keynote address, we have had the activism of civil society, working together with frontline lawyers like him and many others to create a jurisprudence on socioeconomic rights, so that they have been moved from policy, discretionary social policy, to an area where you can say there is a right to livelihood. And how has that happened? Again, the contribution of lawyers, activists. Public interest litigation, allowed by the courts to give citizens standing, so that people could go to court and bring out these issues of health, livelihoods, etc. That was not a given in the Constitution. It was a judicial development, public interest litigation. Similarly, the idea of taking concepts of Western civil rights and turning them on their heads and interpreting them so that you reach out to another concept of rights which absorbs social and economic rights. And the best example is the right to life. In Western jurisprudence, the right to life is a right not to be deprived of life without due process of law. Indian's constitution says right to life. How did the judges interpret it? They interpreted it as that right to live in dignity, with equality, etc. And so expanded the whole confluence and the meaning of the right to life. That's a huge contribution of jurisprudence. And that jurisprudence went in from the Bhagwati court. And India gave leadership to Bangladesh, to Pakistan, to Nepal, to Sri Lanka, in different degrees. But it carried voice, it carried jurisprudence. So those are victories we must declare in our recognition that human rights are relevant for us, they're important, and that indeed we have contributed to the discourse, not the least through academic thought, but also through the judiciary. So I think then, now that human rights has become, in human rights language, something much more than civil and political rights, it has brought in a different concept of state obligation. Because we are talking, when we say universality, what do we mean? All rights for all people. All rights which are claims on government, so that we can claim accountable governance. So what is the state obligation? The duty to respect, don't violate yourself. The duty to fulfill, not just the negative duty not to violate, but positive duty. Instead of fiscal profligacy, to have budgetary allocation for education, for health, so that you can realize the access to education. And my country is a good example of that. Because in my country, because we put education and health in place, the social indicators for women in Sri Lanka far outstrip any other country. That was because even though we didn't have it in the constitution, we put it there. So the universality of socioeconomic rights is a lived experience for the region. And it's our contribution to the human rights. And we should therefore see it as a confluence, which is the very genius of human rights, rather than sit back and say, well, you know, human rights are about civil and political rights. They have really nothing to do with us. And I therefore would like to end with this idea that in this discourse, therefore, we should also understand that the state obligation of protection that has developed now also helps us through this concept of the universal relevance of right to address two of the major challenges that our region is facing as well as the whole globe is facing. One is extremism and the rise of mono identity instead of the plural idea of diversity, which is so familiar for our communities. If you go back to the Asokan tradition, if you go back to much later, we have lived in communities which have been tolerant of each other. Whether you look at the Mughals in India or the subsequent changes, we have lived with diversity. But now what we're seeing is a huge push for a single identity. And I think Dr. Hussain referred to that also. This single identity which is so toxic that you have the manipulation of identity to perpetrate violence. So how then can you address that? Through communication of the values of the universality of human rights, which is born of human experience of struggle with abuse of power. You have to have the balance. And the balance is through the recognition of the human rights norms. Secondly, the influence of the corporate sector. Human rights traditionally are statist. We are talking state obligation. Immediately we exclude the whole area of non-state actors. So your corporates, your families, your communities, you perpetrate violence and violate human rights and you say, no, that's non-state actor. That's a private field. We can't interfere. No. Today the University of Universality of Human Rights means that all the international standard setting has come to the consensus that a state obligation is to protect from violations by non-state actors. So the state has the obligation to ensure that your non-state actors cannot perpetrate the kind of extremism. And therefore, it challenges the politicization of identity, where the government says, we cannot interfere with this because this is a customary, values of a community, we can't do that. How can a minority dictate to a majority? In the case of Muslim communities, for instance, when 51% of the women want Islam to be interpreted in way, can the government say, no, sorry, the mullahs are saying it should be interpreted in this way? No. So that, I think, is very important for the family and the community containing abuse of power, because human rights is about abuse of power and containing abuse of power. Then we regard the corporate sector, the idea that the state has an obligation to control corporates. They can invest, but they can't have a situation where corporates take a life of their own and violate human rights. And that is again very clear. It has come out extremely clearly in the most recent general recommendation of the Economic and Social Rights Committee. They have a general recommendation on what they call the state obligation and business activities. What are they saying there? That the state has a role. The state must control the corporate sector within its boundaries. They can ask for investment, but they can't say, we're not going to interfere because our policy is to attract investment. It has to be controlled. Similarly, where the corporates violate extrajudicially, your companies go to some other country, then this is saying the state has an obligation to control even extrajudicially. So consequently, therefore, the human rights norm and universality, in my view, provides us with a basis for containing two of the greatest threats, both for our region and for us. So therefore, if we can't get our states still to recognize that collectively, if they articulate voice, we're in a powerful situation. Still, I think the people of the South Asian countries can do that for us. Thank you.
Shrestha, would you like to make an opening statement? Yeah, please.
Very good. Mr. Chair, respected Professor Gunasekaran, Dr. Kamal Hussain, President of the South Asian University, and distinguished participants and students. It gives me a great pleasure to be able to come here to speak to you here. I believe on the occasion of this charter, this program is being organized, and this is the best way of celebrating the Charter Day. There could be no better way than organizing on the issue of human rights in the South Asian perspective to celebrate the Charter. I would like to see from different perspective, because I would not like to repeat the same thing that Dr. Kamal Hussain has elaborately explained in detail in the morning. Our freedom and justice movements have been greatly inspired by the idea of the human rights, and there are very tangible benefits that we have enjoyed over time. That part is there. But all the time we cannot repeat the same enjoyment time and again. It's time to revisit where we are now and where we need to go. It seems to me that we South Asian countries, we sit together as a good neighborhood, but we are not being able to deliberate the things jointly. We have never been able to bring out a South Asian perspective on human rights. The topics of the seminar is human rights perspective in South Asia, but whether we have a South Asian perspective, that's a big question. I believe we have many things in common, culturally and socially, but in terms of the human rights, we need to build a different culture of human rights, culture of rule of law. These are the things we need to develop. And for that, I think this type of program would greatly contribute to evolve over time. So I think that based on our experience of life in South Asia, what the Human Development Index would say in many areas, for instance, health, education, sanitation, in all the areas, the Human Development Index, the indicators are not that much pleasant. That doesn't give us a very good impression. So why South Asian people should be identified as the poor people, underdeveloped people, why we are to be projected an image built in that way? That's a very serious question, I think. And it seems to me that violations of rights are the daily life in all segments of rights. We have been able to ratify many of the human rights instruments. Our constitution has been liberal enough to incorporate many human rights or fundamental rights. And we have an enforcement mechanism too. We have a judiciary, we have a human rights commission and major institutions. Apart from that, where we are, why we need to be identified as the poor people, underdeveloped people, this gives us a very gloomy picture, and this situation must be reversed. I mean, I personally believe that unless we comprehensively address the problem of human rights, that doesn't get limited to civil and political rights, that doesn't go across all economic, social, cultural rights, we may not be able to. So this is a question of combating the problem of poverty. That means we need to talk about the comprehensive development justice. And that development justice includes all other rights, including economic, social, cultural rights. This is the issue. And I think Professor Savitri Gunasekaran has very elaborately touched upon, and Dr. Kamal Hussain also in the morning has said light, and there is no disagreement in regard to the implementation of the economic, social, cultural rights. These are the things. But to date, it seems to me that the rights discourse in practice